Usually when we talk about, a grand vision for global harmony, there's this underlying expectation of architectural progress. You picture bringing all the nations of the world together, drawing up the blueprints, and everyone just assumes you're building this magnificent cathedral of peace and prosperity.
Right. It is deeply ingrained in us. I mean, the post-war ideal is basically that humanity coming together to solve big problems from a central hub is the absolute pinnacle of civilization.
But then you step into the world of this particular geopolitical and economic critique, and suddenly that beautiful cathedral looks, well, a lot more like a sprawling, inescapable maze. We are looking at a philosophical landscape today that fundamentally challenges that post-war ideal.
It really does. It flips the whole script.
It does. But now, before we get any further, we need to lay down a really important marker. We are looking at some intense, highly polarizing arguments today. To be clear, we aren't taking sides or endorsing these viewpoints, whether they're left-wing or right-wing. Our mission is strictly to unpack the logic of the source text so you can understand the arguments being made.
Yeah, that's crucial to keep in mind because the core premise we are exploring is a profound challenge to the status quo. The essay we are looking at, Multilateralism is a Utopia, by Yang Kang, argues that the multilateral organizations created in the 20th century, so institutions like the United Nations, the European Union, the WTO, they were built on noble intentions, but have degenerated over time into dystopian, centralized bureaucracies.
Right.
The argument posits that these structures inherently stifle natural human diversity and economic freedom, mostly because they try to force a single artificial order onto a deeply complex world.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the text brings out the heavy artillery right from the start.
Right.
It focuses heavily on a fiery speech delivered in September 2024 by Argentina's president, Javier Milei, at the UN General Assembly.
Oh, yeah. That speech made massive waves.
Exactly. He stood in front of the UN and claimed that the organization has basically mutated from a peacekeeping body into a, quote, multi-tentacled Leviathan.
That phrase, multi-tentacled Leviathan, it just perfectly captures the author's view of an institution that has massively overstepped its original mandate.
It really reminds me of a neighborhood watch. You set up a neighborhood watch because there have been a few break-ins, and the goal is just to keep the streets safe. You agree to pool your resources for this one specific purpose.
Makes total sense.
Right. But then, a few years later, the head of the neighborhood watch is suddenly knocking on your door, dictating what color you must paint your living room, telling you what time to go to bed, and, I don't know, deciding what you can eat for dinner. The mission creep goes from protecting the neighborhood to comprehensively controlling the lives of the people in it.
Yeah, and that mission creep is exactly what the text argues has happened with initiatives like the UN's 2030 Agenda. The source material views this not as a well-intentioned global development plan, but as a supranational socialist program.
Wait, socialist program? How do they make that leap?
Well, the logic here is that when a central, unelected body dictates global goals for energy, education, and economics, it inevitably violates national sovereignty. It begins to infringe upon the rights of local populations to determine their own laws, liberty, and property rights based on their specific local needs.
And the essay doesn't hold back on pointing out the hypocrisies required to maintain this system either. I mean, it highlights how the UN allows authoritarian regimes, it specifically names Cuba and Venezuela, to sit on the Human Rights Council without facing systemic condemnation.
Which is a huge sticking point for critics.
Right. And it also points out the staggering irony of countries that legally punish women for showing skin being placed on the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, all while systematically voting against Israel, which the author positions as the sole representative of freedom and democracy in the Middle East.
The author also uses the 2020 COVID-19 global lockdowns as a prime example of this Leviathan flexing its tentacles.
Oh, that's a contentious one.
Very. The text argues that the UN's support for sweeping, uniform mandates across the globe systematically violated basic freedoms, going so far as to suggest those global mandates should be viewed as crimes against humanity.
What's fascinating here is the mechanism of how this control is exerted over less powerful nations. The text claims this global governance model creates a really toxic relationship with international lending institutions.
Yeah, this is a crucial part of the critique. The argument is that this system forces the world's most vulnerable, developing nations to allocate resources they don't actually have to progressive utopian programs they don't actually need.
Like what, for example?
Well, like mandating complex climate initiatives in a country that doesn't even have a stable power grid. To fund these mandates, these nations have to borrow heavily. They become trapped as permanent debtor nations.
Wow.
Yeah, and the author argues this dynamic ultimately serves the agenda of a small group of global elites who manage the debt and dictate the policies, rather than serving the citizens of those developing countries.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate here for a second. We spent the last 80 years being taught that global unity is the ultimate safeguard, right? The whole point of the post-WWII order was to prevent another global war through consensus.
Right, the never again mentality.
Exactly. So isn't the author's push for decentralization exactly the kind of fractured nationalism that caused the chaos of the early 20th century in the first place?
Wait, usually we're taught that unity and consensus are the ultimate goals. Why does this author believe that trying to rationally design a unified world is actually humanity's greatest hubris?
To answer that, the author actually steps away from modern politics and leans heavily into philosophy and theology, specifically the Scottish Enlightenment and biblical history.
Oh, interesting pivot.
Yeah, the text positions the Tower of Babel from Genesis 11 as the original failed utopia. In that story, humanity tries to build a centralized, monolithic society reaching to the heavens. But God intentionally intervenes, confusing their languages and scattering them, instituting borders and diversity as a necessary limit on human power. So in this view, a decentralized, distributed network of nations isn't a failure of diplomacy. It's actually the natural intended order to prevent tyranny.
Precisely the author's point. And this maps directly onto the economic philosophy of Friedrich Hayek, who the text cites heavily. Have you heard of the fatal conceit?
I have, but remind us what that means in this context.
So Hayek coined the term the fatal conceit to describe the dangerous arrogance of central planners, whether they are socialists, technocrats, or global bureaucrats, who believe they can rationally engineer a society from the top down.
Because they assume they have all the data.
But they never do. Hayek argued that human society and economics are built on spontaneous order. Think of it like a coral reef.
Okay, I'm tracking.
A reef is a highly complex, thriving ecosystem built by millions of individual organisms making tiny local decisions based on their immediate environment. A central planner looks at the reef and says, well, this is messy. Let's organize these corals into neat geometric squares.
Which would obviously kill the reef.
Exactly. The moment they try to enforce that rational design, they destroy the natural mechanisms that keep the reef alive. Knowledge in a society is dispersed among billions of people. It just cannot be centralized.
Right.
When global bureaucrats believe they are all-knowing, they implement their fantasies of social transformation, which eliminates natural diversity and leaves the whole system incredibly fragile.
Which brings to mind that very sharp quote the text uses from George Clemenceau. It goes, if a man is not a socialist by the age of 30, he has no heart. If he's still a socialist after 30, he has no head.
A classic.
It really encapsulates the author's view that these utopia designs are ultimately naive. You can have all the heart in the world, but if you ignore the mechanics of how human societies actually function, you end up with a disaster.
And if the UN is the author's primary example of global hubris, the European Union is presented as the ultimate regional failure of this fatal conceit. The critique here is blistering. The text looks back at Margaret Thatcher as this sort of prophetic voice, specifically citing her speeches from 1988 and 1992.
Thatcher warned that the EU was becoming less like a, quote, common European home, and more like a common European prison, which is a visceral image.
Very.
She was describing a scenario where 30 vastly different countries, spanning from the highly industrialized economic engines of Germany to the distinct agrarian realities of a place like Ukraine, would be forced to adopt the exact same interest rates, the exact same worker rules, and the exact same foreign policy, all directed by a distant bureaucracy in Brussels.
She essentially called it an institution that would be more utopian and thus more doomed to fail than the Tower of Babel itself.
But those warnings were back in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Does the author think Thatcher's gloomy predictions actually came true today?
Oh, absolutely. The essay brings some incredibly stark economic statistics to argue that Thatcher's predictions have fully materialized. Let's look at the numbers. In 2008, the combined economic output of all EU member states was roughly equal to the GDP of the United States. They were essentially tied. Fast forward to 2024, and the U.S. GDP has skyrocketed to $25.5 trillion, while the 28-nation EU is stuck at $16.6 trillion.
That is a massive divergence.
It gets worse. The gap in corporate valuation is even more revealing. The text notes that of the top $10 trillion companies globally in 2024, 9 are American, 0 are European.
Wait, really? Zero.
Zero.
Which tells us this isn't just a slow quarter or a bad business cycle for Europe. It's a systemic failure to compete at scale. And the text provides the on-the-ground mechanic of why this is happening. For instance, the claim that it takes 84 days to start a business in France compared to just 4 days in the U.S.
Right.
I mean, how does a modern developed nation end up with an 84-day waiting period just to open a storefront?
The author traces this directly back to ideology, specifically citing the influence of the Frankfurt School in Germany and a drift toward Marxist collectivism.
Also,
Well, when an intellectual class and a political system prioritize equality of outcome above all else, they have to regulate every single variable to ensure no one gets too far ahead or falls too far behind. To enforce that equity, you have to build an enormous, heavy-handed bureaucratic apparatus. Labor laws become so rigid that hiring and firing are nearly impossible, and taxation becomes totally punitive.
that perfectly explains the Elon Musk anecdote in the text. He tries to build a Tesla gigafactory in Berlin, bringing thousands of jobs and cutting-edge technology. And instead of being welcomed, he faces massive protests from activists decrying the project as technological colonialism.
Yeah, the text points out that in this ideological framework, a business owner is automatically equated with an exploiter.
It's just a completely different mindset.
It is, and this overarching hostility to free enterprise is why the author concludes that overregulation has fundamentally destroyed the European entrepreneurial spirit. The text describes Europe as having become a museum.
A museum.
Ouch. Yeah, it's a place you visit to look at the glories of the past, not to witness the innovations of the future. While America is aggressively building AI and pioneering cryptocurrency, the European bureaucracy is busy debating AI ethics committees and heavily regulating digital assets before they even fully exist.
Right, which naturally triggers a massive brain drain, with highly skilled tech professionals and venture capital fleeing the continent for the United States.
Exactly.
So we see this utopian blindness hollowing out regional integration in Europe. But the essay argues this exact same flaw was applied to global trade, bringing us to the World Trade Organization, specifically around the year 2001 when China was admitted.
The inclusion of China in the WTO is framed as the ultimate stress test of multilateral trade, a test the author believes the system comprehensively failed. The original designers of the WTO relied heavily on Adam Smith's free market logic. You know, the idea that a larger, globally integrated market naturally leads to a more specialized division of labor, driving down costs and raising productivity for everyone.
Reading this section, I kept thinking about a family game night. The author is basically saying the WTO invited everyone to play Monopoly, assuming everyone at the table already agreed on the fundamental rules of free enterprise. You roll the dice, you buy property, you pay rent. But then someone sat down at the table who literally owned the bank, the board, and the dice.
Let's expand on that analogy because it gets to the heart of the economic mechanism here. Imagine playing Monopoly, but the player to your left can just print their own money whenever they land on a property. They can change the zoning laws mid-game, and they dictate the rent you pay them while capping the rent they pay you.
That sounds like a nightmare game.
Right, but that is what the author means when they critique China's economic model within the WTO. The text argues that China operates under a system of state capitalism and mercantilism, where the government monopolizes resources, capital, and land.
The essay uses the term rock-bottom factor costs. Wait, factor costs, you mean the literal price of land, labor, and materials? Because the state owns them, they can just invent the price tag to undercut everyone else.
Exactly the mechanism the author is pointing out. If an American or European company has to pay market rates for real estate, electricity, and labor, but a Chinese state-owned enterprise is granted free land, heavily subsidized energy, and state-controlled labor, they aren't competing on business efficiency. They are competing on state backing.
Wow. Yeah.
The author argues this completely distorts global prices. It allows for deeply unfair competition and incentivizes state-sponsored imitation and intellectual property theft over actual innovation.
Which shatters the entire premise of Adam Smith's free market logic.
It does. The core takeaway the author posits is that free trade is not a naturally occurring phenomenon that just magically happens when you erase borders. Free trade requires an underlying shared political order. Freedom, property rights, and the rule of law are fundamentally political issues.
Right.
If the members of an economic system do not share the exact same underlying values, the system breaks down and is easily exploited.
If the UN has become a leviathan, the EU, a regulatory museum, and the WTO, a rigged game, what is the corrective action? The essay doesn't just leave us in this dystopian loop. It argues that a massive geopolitical correction has already begun.
Yes, the text asks us to look at the political shocks of the last decade through a completely different lens. Many commentators viewed events like Brexit in 2020 as, isolated populist tantrums. The author views Brexit as a rational, necessary correction by the British people, rejecting utopian globalization in favor of national sovereignty.
And the text brings in President Trump's first term as the American version of this exact same correction. It specifically praises the administration's withdrawal from numerous multilateral agreements, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Accord, UNESCO, and the UN Human Rights Council.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author links this modern wave of withdrawals directly back to the founding doctrine of the United States. They point to George Washington's insistence that America should pursue maximum commercial trade with foreign nations, but avoid political entanglements entirely.
It's an old idea making a comeback.
Very much so. The text even grounds this bilateral approach in a biblical principle, citing Philippians 2.3, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit," arguing that a decentralized bilateral world respects boundaries and avoids the arrogant ambition of global control.
Following this trend, the text makes a pretty seismic prediction regarding the future of NATO. Even though NATO just expanded, with Sweden officially joining in early 2024, the essay predicts that the United States will eventually leave the alliance.
Which is a huge claim.
It is. The argument is that European nations must come to terms with the reality that they can no longer rely on American subsidies for their security. They have to fund their own defense. It's the ultimate return to a decentralized world of independent nations taking responsibility for themselves.
It is a sweeping, unapologetic critique. It challenges the very foundation of how global diplomacy, security, and economics have been conducted for the last 80 years, arguing that true stability comes from respecting borders and differences, not erasing them.
We have covered massive ground today. We explored the argument that global organizations are inevitably doomed by a fatal conceit of top-down rational design. We unpacked the stark economic realities of an over-regulated Europe versus a free market America, and we detailed the source's belief that a decentralized bilateral world is the only functional order for humanity.
A lot to chew on.
For sure. For you listening, I want you to think about the organizations you interact with daily, from your corporate office to your local school board. Do you see centralized control in those spaces leading to the kind of stagnation and bureaucracy the author warns about? Or do you find that a strong central structure is actually necessary to keep things moving forward?
Building on that, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder on your own. The author makes a compelling case that a decentralized world is the safest state for humanity, protecting us from the hubris of central planners. But consider this. If we strip away these global institutions because they are inherently flawed or utopian, what happens when we face a truly borderless crisis? Imagine a rogue artificial intelligence that propagates across servers worldwide simultaneously, or a sudden catastrophic atmospheric disaster. Does a purely decentralized world, relying only on slow, bilateral negotiations between individual nations, actually have the tools and the speed to survive a crisis that completely refuses to respect national borders?
That is a fascinating and a slightly terrifying question to leave hanging. We started out looking at blueprints for a grand cathedral of peace that, according to this text, turned into a maze of bureaucracy. The question you have to answer now is whether tearing down that maze leaves us free or just entirely exposed to the elements. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep looking for the underlying logic, and we will catch you next time.